Welcome to Chapter 8. We're going to be talking about motivation, certain concepts and theories related to that motivation, what makes things go in life. And we'll start by doing something terribly simple. We'll take a look at the notion of a motive itself. And actually, a motive is acting as an intervening variable. A motive may provide a single reason for the occurrence of many different behaviors, and a motive may also explain the fluctuations in behavior over time. Sounds reasonable. If you take a look at the notion of a motive and how it corresponds with instinctive behaviors, it'll be important to remember that our instinctive behaviors are automatic. They're involuntary patterns that we display on a consistent basis. They were originally called fixed action patterns, which are constantly or consistently triggered and released by certain stimuli. Now, the sources of motivation that we deal with involve four different factors. Those factors include biology, emotions, cognition, and our social activity. Now, this notion of instinct theory and its descendants tells us that instincts were once upon a time thought to be a major factor in motivation. Instinct theory, however, has managed to provide a description rather than an explanation. Those sorts of behaviors, in addition, instinct theory failed to accommodate the role of learning in human behavior. Let's take a look at the notion of motivation and how it might apply to our evolution or the selection of a mate, for example. Now, the evolutionary approach suggests that inborn desires, that we all possess those inborn desires to pass on our genes, and as a result of that, that causes women to focus on a man's resource acquisition or his capacity, as well as for men to focus on women's reproductive capacity. Surveys have supported the hypothesis. However, mate selection patterns may reflect social and economic influences, not necessarily innate biological needs. Drive reduction theory suggests that primary and secondary drives reduce biological needs caused by the imbalance in homeostasis. What that simply means is that we have primary drives that we have no control over, secondary drives which feed off of the satisfaction of those primary drives. And those significant events occur when our system is out of balance. Now, arousal theory suggests that people are motivated to maintain their optimal level of arousal. Our arousal increases when it's too low, and of course it decreases when it's too high. Optimal arousal levels will vary from person to person. Let's look at it from the standpoint of test anxiety. It's really important for individuals to be quote unquote aroused, as it were, when it comes to taking a test. There's a certain element of edginess that makes the reproduction of material much more able to be taken care of in certain circumstances. It helps us with our recall. The challenge is when we get too overstimulated. In other words, we can find ourselves too amped up over the notion of taking a test, thereby short-circuiting our ability to remember. And as a part of that process, then we cannot recall as well as we might want. And as a result, we often don't do as well. Now, incentive theory suggests that behavior is goal-directed. We behave in ways that allow us to attain desirable stimuli and to avoid negative stimuli. Now, this sort of it values the goal, is what it does. It values the goal as it's influenced by biological and social factors. Now, incentive theory, we could also look at it from a little bit different perspective. I think I've mentioned before that human creatures do things that make them feel good, and we avoid things that make us feel bad. At the end of the day, that's somewhat like incentive theory. When it's goal-directed, we are going to behave in ways that allow us to receive desirable results. Now, if we look at the whole idea of motivation from the perspective of hunger, there are a number of biological signals that tell us it's time to eat, as it were. Now, we know that we get signals from the stomach. The stomach may partially control the hunger motive, but the cues may operate primarily when people are very hungry or, interestingly enough, very full. We get signals from the bloodstream. The brain monitors blood content for the presence of nutrients like glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids, and hormones like insulin or leptin, whose presence will communicate hunger or satiety to the body. Now, one of the challenges that I've often encountered with numerous individuals is that they're unable to read or to understand when their body is full. So what they do is they continue to overeat by accident because their chemicals are not working like they typically should. And as a result, the body does not trigger itself to stop eating. Now, there are also a handful of issues related to cultural activity as it relates to food, as well as eating and even food selection. Flavor and variety are important in initiating the eating process. More food will be eaten when the variety of taste is expanded. Classical conditioning, which basically suggests that we pair the taste with the nutritional value, influences the preference of a variety of foods. The sight of food can elicit conditioned responses. For example, the secretion of saliva, gastric juices, and even insulin that are associated with eating. Specific hungers, the desire for certain foods at certain times, may reflect the biological need for a nutrient found in those foods. Finally, social cues often tell people what and how much are appropriate to eat in certain social situations. How many of you want to eat something sweet very late at night? How many of you often want something salty at a specific time of the day? Most of us, if we exert ourselves to any great degree, exercise, for example, we'll find ourselves wanting something salty after the fact. The body is trying to replenish the loss of sodium. When it comes to a full stomach after a good meal, often some of us want something sweet to eat. It helps level off the stomach acid. It also helps us remain much more satiated into the evening. Now, the challenge we run into is that we can develop a number of different sorts of eating disorders. Now, obesity, for example, is a condition of severe overweightness that can contribute to diabetes. It contributes to high blood pressure and an increased risk for heart attack. Physiological factors that may predispose people to obesity include body type, more and larger fat cells, and a higher set point. Psychological factors include maladaptive reactions to stress. How many of us are stress eaters? I've mentioned in numerous classes, if my wife comes home and sees that I'm cooking fried chicken, she gets out of the way. She knows that it's been a terribly stressful day and that I'm going to eat myself sick. And as a result, I tend to do that. Another disorder called anorexia nervosa is an eating disorder that's characterized by the preoccupation with food and self-starvation and dramatic weight loss. Physical causes are unknown, but psychological factors that contribute to anorexia nervosa include the preoccupation with thinness. As a part of anorexia nervosa, people have not only a maladaptive perspective of themselves, they look at the mirror and don't see themselves as they truly are. As a result, they tend to see themselves as overweight, and they tend to then starve themselves or at least lessen their intake of food, such that the body decreases its overall capability over time. One of the challenges that comes up with therapy work with individuals who have anorexia nervosa is that sometimes it becomes more important to deal with the physical issues first before you can deal with any of the emotional difficulty. Bulimia nervosa is another eating disorder that's characterized typically by binging and purging, and it's usually not life-threatening, but the victim may be thin, have normal weight, or maybe even be overweight. Bulimia nervosa appears to be caused by cultural factors, emotional problems, and possible malfunctioning biological mechanisms. Now, at the end of the day, what it boils down to is that we have a number of different things that get in our way when it comes to motivation and how we deal with those sorts of situations. Please remember that incentive theory is behavior that's goal-directed. We will behave in certain ways that help us get what it is that we want. Motivation theorists will distinguish between wanting and liking. Wanting is the process of being attracted to incentives, whereas liking is the immediate evaluation of how pleasurable a stimulus is when it's experienced. Again, a number of complicated issues. So when it comes to incentive theory, there are a couple of questions I'd like to leave you with. How does your incentive to eat influence the possibility of contracting or experiencing anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa? If you are an individual who is seeking to be financially wealthy, or are you seeking a physically attractive mate or a physically healthy mate? What sorts of people are you attracted to? What is it that turns you crank? What about incentive theory when it comes to the care of our children? How many of us are willing to throw ourselves in front of automobiles for the sake of our children's safety? Different sorts of questions to take a consideration of. Let me thumb down here so I can get to them. When it comes to motivation, another issue that comes up, not so much as a question just yet, but is the idea of willpower. How is it that we're able to exercise such a thing? Most people I know have great difficulty with willpower. Most of us actually have too little of it, whatever it happens to be. Maybe you could take a look at the concept in light of the theories that we've taken a quick gander at so far. Behaviorists would say that there's no such thing as willpower. Our actions are simply the result of association and reinforcement, and there is some truth to that. The notion of motivation as a force to generate behavior would be unacceptable to those individuals considering themselves to be behaviorists. Willpower, from a cognitive perspective, is an internal force that moves a person in some direction or other. Behavior is powered by strong needs or guilt or even anxiety. How would humanistic individuals deal with the idea of willpower? Again, lots of ways to ponder the circumstance. Motivation related to our ideas of curiosity. How often do you find yourself trying to solve some sort of puzzle? Humans are inherently curious people. We want to know about everything and everybody, at least to some degree. There are a number of motivational properties of frustration that result from interrupted goal seeking. We get our minds focused on a particular thing and we can't let go of that. Now, I know I'm hurrying through a little bit of a lecture, and if I was sitting in front of you, we would be able to interact a little bit more. But at the same time, what I want you to be mindful of is that we are motivated to do a number of different factors in a number of different ways. And what we'll talk about next time, we're going to start with sex, the wonderful idea of what motivates us to be sexual creatures. If you have any question, have any other concerns about your signature assignment or anything else you're working on at the moment, drop me an email. You can always send a text. I'll get back on the line for you as soon as I can. Have a good afternoon.